This is the Port of Los Angeles. Together with its neighbor Long Beach, it handles roughly 31% of America's containerized imports, the single most important trade gateway in the Western Hemisphere. And in the World Bank's 2024 global ranking of container port efficiency, they sit at 359th and 318th out of 403 ports. Meanwhile, the number one most efficient port on Earth is Yangshan, outside Shanghai, holding that top position for the third consecutive year. Shanghai alone now handles more containers than the top 10 American ports combined, 55.06 million TEU in 2025 versus 51.6 million. Yet, America invented the shipping container. The entire system that made China's ports possible was created in Newark, New Jersey. So, how did the country that created containerization end up with such inferior ports? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the exact moment the shipping container was born. On April 26, 1956, a converted World War II oil tanker called the Ideal X sailed out of Port Newark, New Jersey, carrying 58 metal containers bound for Houston. The man behind it, Malcolm McLean, wasn't even a shipping guy. He was a trucking magnate from North Carolina who'd spent his career watching cargo sit on docks for weeks while dock workers loaded it onto ships barrel by barrel. But he knew the system could be improved. So he sold his trucking company, bought a steamship line, and bet everything on one simple idea. The cargo should never be unpacked until it reaches its final stop. The economics were almost absurd. Hand-loading loose cargo onto a ship costs about $5.86 per ton. Loading McLean's containers cost just 16 cents each. And America ran with it. In January 1959, an American company called Paceco put the world's first purpose-built container crane to work in Alameda, California. A traditional group of dock workers moved about 9 tons of cargo an hour. The crane moved about 400. And ship turnaround times fell from roughly 3 weeks to about 18 hours. Of course, the container had its casualties too. Manhattan and Brooklyn's famous finger piers, those narrow docks sticking out into the river, had no room for the giant flat storage yards that containers needed. So within a generation, New York's waterfront simply died. The action had moved across the harbor to Newark and Elizabeth, New Jersey, flat marshland purpose-built for shipping containers. The harbor's longshore workforce shrank from 35,000 to about 3,500 over the 60s and 70s. But of course, with this kind of automation came a different set of obstacles. In 1960, the West Coast Dock Workers Union cut a deal with the shipping companies, bring in all the machines they want, and in exchange, take care of their employees. It worked so well that within a few years, the union's legendary leader, Harry Bridges, was demanding more machines, arguing that mechanization should be compulsory. The East Coast Dock Workers Union, meanwhile, spent the whole decade striking against the machines instead. But here's the thing. These ports don't create trade, they chase it. A port is just a doorway, and what matters is what's behind that door. Starting in the 1980s, what was behind America's door moved. Manufacturing eventually went to East Asia due to the cheap cost, and world shipping moved across the Pacific with it. China's response was one of the most aggressive infrastructure programs in human history. Ports were written directly into the country's 5-year plans, the master economic blueprints Beijing publishes every 5 years. Financed by state banks and built on empty coastline with no neighbors to object and no competing agencies to consult. Between 1978 and 2018, China built more than 2,300 new deep water berths, the docking slots where ships load and unload. That's the equivalent of building a major new port every 10 months, for 40 years straight. In 1990, Hong Kong was the only Chinese port among the world's leaders. By 2011, 6 of the world's 8 largest container ports were Chinese. And in 2010, Shanghai passed Singapore to become the world's busiest container port by throughput, a title it's held every year from since then. But the centerpiece of the whole strategy was the port that I mentioned in the beginning, Yangshan. See, by the 1990s, Shanghai had a problem. Its port sat on a river, and the river was too shallow for the new generation of megaships. There was no room left on the coastline either. So China decided that if Shanghai didn't have a deep water port, it would build one in the open ocean. Engineers took 2 rocky islands about 20 miles offshore, flattened them, reclaimed the sea between them, and connected the whole thing to the mainland with the Donghai Bridge, a 20-mile, 6-lane highway over open water, built by 6,000 workers in about 3 years. The port was proposed in 1995. China's State Council approved it in March 2002. Construction started 3 months later, and on December 10, 2005, the first ships docked at Yangshan, from idea to operating port in about a decade, and from final government approval to first ship in about 3.5 years. Now, let me show you what a decade in America gets you. Savannah, Georgia has the country's 4th busiest container port by volume, and for years it had one clear problem. Its river channel was 42 feet deep, and the newest ships needed 47. Feasibility studies for deepening it began in 1997. Congress authorized the project in 1999. The dredging was finished in 2022. 25 years later, the project was designed around ships of 8,200 TEU. By the time it was finished, Savannah was serving ships twice that size. China built the most efficient port on Earth from open water in less time than it took America to deepen an existing one. Though, to be fair, this isn't just a permitting problem. It's geography and timing too. American ports are boxed in by the cities that grew up around them. There's no empty coastline option in Los Angeles or New York, no offshore island to flatten. And China happened to be building at the exact moment ships exploded in size. China's ports were designed for the ships of the future, while America's were already built to the standards of the 1960s. It turns out that when it comes to infrastructure, being first is actually a curse. Then came the thing that made the gap way bigger: automation. In December 2017, Yangshan opened Phase 4 Automated Terminal, the largest automated container terminal on Earth. 26 remote-controlled dockside cranes, 130 driverless electric vehicles ferrying containers across the yard, 120 automated stacking cranes, and almost nobody on the ground. The few humans involved sit at screens. And by 2021, some were operating cranes from a command center more than 60 miles away. The terminal runs 24 hours a day, and its labor productivity is over twice that of a conventional terminal. The efficiency gap is this: when large container ships stop at a Chinese port, they spend a median of 14 hours there. At an American port, they take 26 hours, which is massive logistically. So why hasn't America followed? Well, because the labor bargain that made mechanization possible in 1960 broke down. Once the machines could start replacing operators, the West Coast Union turned against them, and the East Coast went even further by fully banning automated equipment outright in its 2018 contract. Then, on October 1st, 2024, this all turned into a national crisis. The International Longshoremen's Association, basically the union, launched its first coast-wide strike since 1977, shutting down every port from Maine to Texas, ports that handle roughly half of America's containerized imports. About 50,000 workers walked out with two demands: a massive raise and an airtight ban on automation. The strike lasted 3 days before being suspended on a tentative wage deal, and the final 6-year contract has fully automated equipment staying banned. Any new technology requires union agreement. The East Coast is now effectively locked out of automation into the 2030s. But the union isn't the villain here, don't get me wrong, because the evidence that automation even pays off is messier than you'd think. A March 2024 report by the Government Accountability Office studied the 10 largest American ports and found automation's effects on efficiency and jobs were mixed. At LA and Long Beach, a union-commissioned study found automation destroyed hundreds of jobs, while an employer-commissioned study found the automated terminals actually increased paid work hours because they moved twice the cargo. And automation is rarer worldwide than you'd think, because the upfront cost is so enormous that a terminal usually needs at least 2.5 million TEU a year to justify it, which is more than most American ports handle. That's why only 4 cargo terminals in all of the US use automated cargo carriers. So the American choice wasn't stupidity or anything, it was a political decision to protect tens of thousands of well-paid middle-class jobs instead of chasing raw throughput. The difference is that China never had that negotiation. When Yangshan Phase 4 cut its labor costs by 70%, Nobody went on strike because nobody could. But there's still more to the story though. If you go to almost any major American port and look up at the ship-to-shore cranes, you'll find that most of them were built in Shanghai. They come from Shanghai Zhenhua Heavy Industries, or ZPMC for short, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. According to a September 2024 House Select Committee report, ZPMC built about 80% of the ship-to-shore cranes at American ports, and controls roughly 70% of the global market. At the Port of Virginia, every single ship-to-shore crane is ZPMC. Remember Paceco, the American company that invented the container crane back in 1959? It started licensing its designs to foreign manufacturers in the 1960s, got sold to a Japanese firm in 1988, and in 1989, the last American-made ship-to-shore crane rolled out of a plant in Gulfport, Mississippi. Not a single one has been built in the United States since. ZPMC was founded 3 years after that in 1992, and within 6 years, it was the largest crane manufacturer in the world, underbidding Western rivals by 30 to 50%, and delivering its cranes fully assembled on its own fleet of heavy lift ships. Also, ZPMC's net profit margin is around 2%. It doesn't need to make money, because it's basically a tool of Chinese industrial strategy that just happens to sell cranes. Washington has noticed, of course. In 2021, the FBI found undocumented cellular modems on ZPMC cranes delivered to the Port of Baltimore, and Congress now openly warns the cranes could double as a surveillance platform. So in 2024, the White House announced more than $20 billion for port infrastructure to bring crane manufacturing back to America, and the anchor grant went to Paceco, now a subsidiary of Japan's Mitsui. The same company that invented the crane gave it away and is now being paid to reinvent it 65 years later. So the natural question is this all just a money problem? If America spent enough, could it catch up? Well, no. The gap is baked into how American ports are set up, and it comes down to 3 things. The first is governance. The Port of Shanghai has one operator, Shanghai International Port Group, an arm of the state that coordinates directly with customs, rail, and China's state-owned shipping line. China's customs reforms cut required trade documents from 89 to 52, and clearance times by 41%. Now look at San Pedro Bay. Los Angeles and Long Beach aren't even one port. They're 2 separate ports owned by 2 separate cities, competing with each other in the same bay, each leasing terminals to about a dozen private operators who don't even share their data with each other. The federal government had to build a voluntary data sharing program in 2022 just to convince the players in America's own supply chain to tell each other what's coming. The second is the clock. Chinese ports run 24/7 as the default. Many American terminal gates run weekday business hours, which means the most valuable trade infrastructure in the hemisphere sits idle on nights and weekends. And when America tried to change that during the 2021 supply chain crisis, when 100 ships sat at anchor waiting off LA and Long Beach on a single October day, Washington's big fix was pushing the port to 24/7 operations. It barely moved the needle, because there weren't enough truckers to pick up containers at 3 a.m., and the warehouses they delivered to were closed anyways. A port is only as fast as the rest of the supply chain. Which brings us to the third reason, the landslide. In 2025, Shanghai's sea-to-rail container volume crossed 1 million TEU for the first time, up 16% in a single year, moving on freight corridors built for that exact purpose. In America, 18 of the 25 largest ports have on-dock rail, so most containers leave on trucks over congested public highways. In the American Society of Civil Engineers 2025 Infrastructure Report Card, American ports themselves scored a B. The inland waterways that serve them scored a C-. What's crazy though is that the maintenance money for the infrastructure to be quality has existed the whole time. Since 1986, America has charged a special tax on port cargo, the harbor maintenance fee, a 0.125% of the cargo's value, collected specifically to pay for dredging and upkeep. But for decades, Congress collected the money and simply didn't spend it. By 2020, the fund had piled up a roughly $10 billion unspent balance, while the infrastructure it was supposed to maintain faced massive backlogs. It took an act of Congress that year just to start releasing it. A few $100 million at a time. And when you put the money side by side, the scale becomes almost comical. From 2012 to 2019, the Chinese government devoted an estimated $153 billion to constructing new port facilities and upgrading existing port infrastructure. By comparison, the US government spent less than $110 billion on all water transportation infrastructure over the same period. So the last thing is, does any of this actually matter? I mean, the goods will still arrive. Well, every extra hour a ship sits at an American dock is basically a hidden tax on everything Americans buy. And in a crisis like 2021 showed, that tax explodes. The honest conclusion is that America's ports aren't inferior because the country forgot how to build. They're inferior because of choices. Thank you for watching.